Imagine a time several thousand years ago, long before cars, mobile phones, or even schools existed. People lived close to nature and were completely dependent on it to survive. Then something big happened. People began building the very first large societies, the civilizations. And almost all of these early civilizations emerged in the same kind of place, by rivers. Why? Rivers provided drinking water, water for farming, the ability to travel and trade goods, and even protection. In this film, we will explore three of the very first river cultures: Mesopotamia along the Euphrates and Tigris, the Harappan culture along the Indus River, and China's earliest culture along the Huang, the Yellow River. Come along and we'll see how these early societies laid the foundation for the world we live in today. Before we begin, we need to be clear about what this film will help you understand. First, you will get a grasp of what a river culture actually is, and why people began building societies right there. Second, you will learn to recognize the common features that all river cultures shared. For example, irrigation farming, how cities arose and people took on different jobs, how writing systems and laws were invented, and how religion and technology played an important role. And finally, you will practice comparing, seeing both similarities and differences between the different river cultures. In other words, the film gives you both facts and tools for understanding how the first civilizations worked. So let's get started. A river culture is a large society, a civilization that arises by a river. It is the river that makes it possible. There, people could grow more food than they themselves needed. When there was surplus food, more people could live in the same place. That made societies grow, with cities, laws, occupations, and religion. In short, the river was the foundation of the entire civilization. Rivers often flooded. For people back then, that could feel both frightening and dangerous, since the water could destroy houses and fields. But the floods were also a gift. When the water receded, a layer of silt was left on the ground. Silt is tiny grains of soil and minerals carried by the river. This soil was dark, moist, and full of nutrients, perfect for growing wheat, barley, fruit, and vegetables. That meant people could get much more food than before. And they could store food for times when harvests were worse. With the help of the river and the fertile soil, societies could grow bigger and stronger. The floods, which first seemed like a disaster, instead became the foundation of success. But living near a great river was not always simple. First, floods could be irregular. Sometimes too little water came and the harvests failed. Sometimes too much came and both houses and fields were destroyed. Second, stagnant water could spread disease. When many people and animals lived close together, the risk of diseases spreading quickly also increased. And finally, rivers required organization. To control the water, people needed to cooperate and build canals, ditches, and dams. That meant society needed leaders, rules, and work teams to direct the effort. In other words, rivers provided opportunities, but they also demanded knowledge and cooperation. The rivers gave people a reliable supply of water. That meant they could farm every year and get more harvests than before. When the harvests were large, there was food left over, a surplus. The surplus was very important because it meant not everyone had to be farmers. Instead, some could become craftspeople, soldiers, priests, or leaders. This is the very core of why civilizations grew. When food was enough for more people, new occupations and new ideas could also develop. When people lived near a river, they needed to cooperate. To control the water, they built canals, ditches, and dams, large projects that required many people working together. But such projects only worked if there was organization. Someone had to decide who did what and make sure the work was fairly distributed. This made societies begin to have leaders. The The leaders needed rules and laws to keep order, and scribes who could count, record, and plan. In short, the rivers created not only agriculture, they also created the need for power, rules, and leadership. The rivers became like roads through the landscape. Along them, people could travel by boat, trade goods, and meet other peoples. This made trade much easier. But it was not only goods that spread. Ideas, technologies, and culture did too. Writing systems, religions, inventions, and new ways of building could spread from one civilization to another. Rivers, therefore, connected people not only within a society, but also between different cultures. Now we know why civilizations arose by rivers. But where in the world did this happen? Look at the map. Here we see the 4 major river cultures. In Egypt, society grew along the Nile. In Mesopotamia, the area between the Euphrates and Tigris, some of the world's first cities were built. In India, the Harappan culture emerged by the Indus River. And in China, early societies arose by the Yellow River, the Huang. In this film, we will focus on Mesopotamia, India, and China. Egypt gets its own film. We begin our journey in Mesopotamia, the area often called the cradle of civilization. Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers. And that is exactly right, because the 2 great rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, flowed here. Thanks to the rivers, people were able to build some of the world's very first cities. Many ideas were also born here that we still recognize today, such as laws, routing systems, and organized societies. Mesopotamia thus became the starting point for much of what we later associate with civilization. Mesopotamia was full of important cities. Some of the most famous were Uruk, Ur, and Babylon. Tens of thousands of people lived here, which was enormous for the time. Society was based on irrigation agriculture. Water was led from the rivers through canals to grow crops. The cities often functioned as small independent states, so-called city-states. Each city had its own rulers and gods. Trade was lively. People exchanged goods such as grain, wool, and crafts for wood, metal, and other resources that were lacking in the area. In the middle of the city, there often rose a temple, a ziggurat, where people worshiped the gods. Mesopotamia was also the place where the world's first writing system arose, cuneiform. People wrote on clay tablets with sharp reeds. Writing was used to tally goods, record stories, and set down laws. One of the most famous law codes is Hammurabi's laws, which showed how society was governed and what punishments awaited those who broke the rules. Mesopotamia left behind several important legacies that have influenced all of human history. They developed early knowledge in mathematics and astronomy. They could count, measure land, and follow the stars in the sky. That helped them know when it was time to sow and harvest, but also to build more advanced houses and temples. Another major legacy is the early law texts. Hammurabi's laws are perhaps the best known. They show how, almost 4,000 years ago, people already wrote down rules for how to live together and what punishments applied if you broke them. These legacies, mathematics, astronomy, and laws, laid the groundwork for much of what we take for granted in our societies today. Now we leave Mesopotamia and move east. Here, by the Indus River, another great civilization arose, the Harappan culture. It was contemporary with Mesopotamia, but developed in its own way. The Indus culture is something of a mystery to historians, because much is still unknown. But what we do know shows that it was an advanced society with cities that were far ahead of their time. The Indus culture is best known for its impressive cities. 2 of the largest were Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. Unlike many other early cities, these were carefully planned. The streets lay in straight lines like a grid, just like in modern city plans. They also had something very unusual for their time: advanced sewage systems and wells. Almost every house had access to water and could carry away wastewater. That shows that hygiene was important in the Indus culture. In addition, standardized weights and measures were used. That meant trade could take place in a fair and organized way because everyone measured in the same way. In other words, the Indus culture was far ahead both in urban planning, technology, and everyday life. The Indus culture also had its own writing system. They used small seals, that is, stamps or markers on which they carved symbols. The problem for us today is that scholars have not yet managed to decipher the language. We therefore do not know exactly what they wrote, but we do know that they had contact with other cultures. The Indus culture traded with Mesopotamia, exchanging goods such as cotton textiles and jewelry for metal and other resources. The legacy of the Indus culture is seen above all in their urban planning. The grid streets, drains, and wells show an advanced view of hygiene and infrastructure. They were thus far ahead of their time when it came to building functioning and well-organized cities. After Mesopotamia and the Indus culture, we move even further east to China. Here, by the Huang, the Yellow River, one of the world's oldest civilizations arose. The river got its name from the yellow loess soil carried by the water, which made the land fertile. But just as in the other river cultures, life by the river was both an opportunity and a risk. The Yellow River was sometimes called China's sorrow because the powerful floods could destroy everything in their path. Despite that, this is where the foundations of Chinese civilization were laid. Along the Yellow River in China, several early dynasties arose. The very first is called the Xia, but scholars are uncertain whether it really existed. We do know, however, that both the Shang and Zhou dynasties played a major role in early Chinese history. Society was based on agriculture. People mainly grew millet, a type of grain, but also wheat. To protect the harvests from the powerful floods, people built irrigation systems and levees along the river. That shows that here too, just as in Mesopotamia and the Indus culture, the river was both a source of life and a challenge that required organization and cooperation. In China, a very special writing system developed. The earliest texts we know are found on so-called oracle bones, animal bones or turtle shells used in divination. People carved questions to the gods and then heated the bones until cracks appeared. The cracks were interpreted as answers. On the oracle bones, we can see the very first Chinese characters. This is especially exciting because they are the beginning of the Chinese writing system, a writing system that never disappeared but continued to develop and is still used today. Writing thus became a central part of China's culture from the very start. One thing all river cultures had in common was that they developed new technology to manage daily life. To handle the water, they built canals, dams, and large reservoirs. They also invented tools to lift water to the fields, such as simple pumps and levers. In construction, they used different materials depending on what was available: clay for bricks, stone, and wood. They built walls to protect the cities and planned the streets for order and structure. They also developed important systems of knowledge. With mathematics and calendars, they could keep track of time and calculate when to sow and harvest. And through writing systems, they could collect taxes, write laws, and plan the society. Technology and innovations enabled the river cultures to grow from small villages into large civilizations that influenced all of history. In the river cultures, religion was a central part of life. Many of the gods were connected to nature, to the rivers, the sun, and fertility. That was not surprising because it was nature's forces that decided whether people would have food and be able to survive. To understand and influence nature's rhythm, people performed various rituals. Offerings, ceremonies, and prayers were ways to try to win the gods' favor. Religion also gave power to rulers. Kings and priests could say that their authority came from the gods. In this way, religion became a way to create order and cohesion in society. In other words, religion was not only a belief, it was also a foundation for both everyday life and politics in the river cultures. Now we have looked at three great river cultures: Mesopotamia, the Indus culture, and China. Let us compare them a little. All three lay by great rivers. Mesopotamia between the Euphrates and Tigris, the Indus culture by the Indus River, and China by the Huang, the Yellow River. They had different cities: Uruk and Babylon in Mesopotamia, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa in the Indus culture, and in China, cities such as Anyang. The rivers gave life, but the floods differed. In Mesopotamia, they were irregular. In the Indus Valley, they were influenced by the monsoon. And in China, they were so powerful that the river got the nickname China's Sorrow. The writing systems also differed. Mesopotamia had cuneiform. The Indus culture had its own script, which we still cannot decipher. And in China, writing began with oracle bones and later developed into Chinese characters. Politically, they also looked different. Mesopotamia was ruled by city-states and kings. The Indus culture seems to have had a less clear central power, but highly planned cities. And in China, early dynasties, such as the Shang and Zhou, took power. In terms of building techniques, they used different materials: mud brick and walls in Mesopotamia, wells and drains in the Indus culture, and in China, levees, wood, earth, and bronze. In summary, we see both similarities and differences. All were dependent on the rivers, but they developed in different ways. Together, they show how people early on began to build advanced societies that laid the foundation for our shared history. When we learn about the river cultures, we build on different sources. Examples include clay tablets with cuneiform, small seals and trade receipts from the Indus culture, and oracle bones from China. These are primary sources, that is, things that remain from the time when people lived. But even though the sources are exciting, we must always think critically about them. We can ask questions such as, who is the sender? When was it written? For what purpose? Did they want to inform, influence, or perhaps frighten? And what is missing in the source material? Which voices do we not hear? By using sources and thinking critically about them, we get a fairer and more nuanced picture of what life in the river cultures actually looked like. On the left, you now see a list of what you should keep track of. Let us briefly review each point. First, a river culture is a civilization that arises by a river. The river provided water, fertile soil, and opportunities for agriculture. Second, rivers brought both opportunities and challenges. They provided food and transport, but also risk of floods and disease, and they required cooperation and organization. Third, examples of river cultures are Mesopotamia between the Euphrates and Tigris, the Indus culture by the Indus River, and China by the Huang, the Yellow River. Fourth, important legacies from these cultures are writing systems, laws, technology, religion, urban planning, and trade that spread ideas. And finally, we need to be able to compare the river cultures and think critically about sources in order to understand both similarities, differences, and what the sources actually tell us. Thank you for watching this film about river cultures. We hope you now have a clearer picture of how it all began.